Explore the latest innovations in AI-powered SASE at SASE Converge, Palo Alto Network's premier virtual event. Featuring experts and technologists from companies across the globe, this event reveals how SASE is transforming IT and end-user experiences while raising the bar on security. Watch on demand now at saseconverge.paloaltonetworks.com. That's saseconverge.paloaltonetworks.com.
Take a network break. I'm Johna Johnson.
And I'm John Burke.
Grab a virtual donut as we blaze through this week's IT news. Today, we're going to talk about getting good LLMs to do bad things, Dell's workforce downsizing, Cloudflare's recent outage, some developments in space networking, and more. But first, just want to remind everybody, if you like Network Break, please check out our other podcasts, including Day 2 DevOps, Heavy Networking, Network Automation Nerds, Packet Protector, and of course, Heavy Strategy, the show that John and I host about how to think about technology strategy. Find all of them and much more at packetpushers.net. So let's go ahead and get started. John, what is our first red alert?
The red alert today, and I still wish we had that Star Trek music. Popular Kubernetes ingress controller suffers from remote code execution vulnerability. Of the more than 1,250 CVEs that were issued or updated this past week, 340 scored critical or 9.5 or better on a 10-point scale, and 18 scored that perfect 10. Our highlighted item came in at 9.8. It is CVE 2025-1974, a remote code execution vulnerability in Ingress Nginx, an ingress controller that turns Kubernetes pod ingress requirements into Nginx configurations. This is one of a cluster of 5 vulnerabilities that were reported this past week, although the rest got much lower scores. The folks at Kubernetes underscore the criticality of this problem, and they actually used boldface in their announcement. CVE 2025-1974 means that anything on the pod network has a good chance of taking over your Kubernetes cluster with no credentials or administrative access required. Kubernetes has released a patched version of the code for Ingress Nginx, and it resolves all 5 vulnerabilities, and they urge everyone using the controller, and they say 40% of Kubernetes admins do, to immediately patch.
John, this sounds pretty serious, but it also sounds like Greek unless you happen to be a Kubernetes person. So for folks who aren't, and to whom this is perhaps purely of academic interest, do you want to explain what you mean by anything on the pod network?
Sure. And if you're not working with Kubernetes, it doesn't mean nobody in your institution is. And this is dangerous because in Kubernetes land, a pod is the smallest execution unit in a deployment. It is a container or set of containers that encapsulates one or more applications. They're usually ephemeral, meaning if it runs into any kind of problems, if a computer fails that the pod's executing on, it spins up a replacement. The thing is, this is providing a pathway from a pod and anything that pod is connected to on the network into the Kubernetes administrative structure itself. So your whole Kubernetes environment can be compromised by one pod being compromised. And yes, this could be very bad for your whole service delivery environment.
So if you're a networking person listening to this going, okay, what do I do about this? The answer is fire off an email or a quick Slack message or Teams message to your Kubernetes folks and say, hey, I'm sure you know about this, but just in case, probably wise. Belt and suspenders, as we say around here.
Whoever's responsible has to patch. The call is coming from inside the house. This is not something you can fix from the outside on the network.
Okay. And John, we have one more fun and interesting cybersecurity one.
I am loving this story. I love everything about how to make LLMs do dumb stuff. So Cato has found a new AI jailbreak technique to get AI to build malware for you. Researchers at Cato, which is a network as a service and SASE provider, have discovered a new method for getting LLMs to do things that are at odds with their alignment training, i.e. the things that they have been taught to not do. The technique is called Immersive World, and it requires weaving into the prompting a detailed description of a virtual world in which hacking is normal and approved of. Within that context, several prominent LLMs were convinced that they should help the prompter create browser-based malware for stealing passwords. This version of narrative engineering worked against recent versions of DeepSeek, Microsoft's Copilot, and ChatGPT, which all helped the prompter to build an exploit for Chrome that would steal passwords from people using the browser.
And this, my friends, is the reason that fixing LLMs is actually much harder than it appears, because they are vulnerable to the play pretend hack. Let's play pretend that you are a bad LLM. What would you do? And off they go. And this is also an example of the kind of harm that the developers of Harmbench, who we talked about a couple episodes ago, were warning people of, which is that you can take a perfectly reasonable LLM and convince it to do all sorts of things that are societally harmful, including this, but not limited to this. There are all sorts of other horrible things you can talk it into doing. So yes, watch out for the play pretend hack. And there really isn't a fix, right, John, that we know of?
No, not so far. Certainly, alignment training can make it harder for this to take effect. But what we've seen from other research labs and experience over the last couple of years is that typically, if you just keep trying and slightly vary your approach, you'll eventually get the LLM to do the thing you're trying to get it to do.
Yes, LLMs are designed to please, and that basically is the problem. Okay, pivoting, we want to talk a little bit about Dell's workforce, which is down 10% since 2024 after intentional layoffs and the RTTO return to the office push. Dell announced that its headcount dropped from 120,000 to 108,000 between February 2024 and February 2025. Some of the decrease is intentional due to layoffs in August of 2024, which was presented as necessary precursor to reframing sales operations in the world of AI. What's interesting, though, is that the rest is down due to higher than usual attrition, which can be attributed to employee resistance to these return to the office mandates. In February of 2024, half of Dell's staff opted to remain remote workers, even at the price of losing out on promotions. Since then, Dell mandated that staff living within 90 minutes of an office return to the office 5 days a week. Does this sound familiar? Your company may have asked you to do this. If you don't happen to work at Dell, there are plenty of other ones that did. And as a result, people didn't. So far, the shrinking workforce did not appear to have hurt either revenues or profits, which are up 8% year over year. Revenues are up 8% year over year. Profits are up 3%, but share price declined by 8% in 2025. So you could argue that losing people helps revenue and profits, but hurts your share price. I don't know. That's maybe we need a few more data points to start coming to a conclusion. But I will highlight that the real question is the long-term impact,
Right.
because according to the research we've done, the people that are most likely to leave due to return to the office mandates are people that could do anything anywhere and have skills that are in demand. And moreover, not that I need to point this out, some of those people, a very small percentage, but a small percentage is all that's needed, will go off and start their own companies and will become the Dells of next year or the next decade. So it's kind of a stupid thing to tick off your top employees by insisting they show up in an office because you feel like you need to use up that office space. John, a question. Why do you think the market reacted unfavorably to, positive growth in revenue and profits?
It's the forecast, apparently. I'm not a stock market analyst myself, but apparently shares fell at least in part because Dell's projections for the quarter and the full year, fiscal 2026 for them, were lower than expected. Analysts had expected that overall Dell would get to close to 104 billion, but Dell's own projection of 101 to 105, the midpoint is 103 billion, so we're coming in like $1 billion lower than that. Shares go down. It's also likely that Dell suffered in the sort of mini panic that followed the big public debut of DeepSeek, because it's just one of the big data center stocks for AI data centers, and also possibly because Microsoft has been pulling back on its own AI data center expansions, as was reported on this show a few weeks back.
That makes a lot of sense, John. So I think the jury's still out on the impact of RTTO, but here we have it, that definitely it will. We have positive evidence that it does increase voluntary attrition, which is short term a good thing, arguably, but long term arguably a very bad thing. So we shall see.
We shall. So On the subject of highly skilled employees, let's talk
Right.
about a credential management error at Cloudflare that led to an hour-long outage of its storage service. According to Cloudflare's own report, its R2 object storage service and other services that depend on it were out of commission for a little over an hour on March 21st. Users experienced 100% write failures globally and 35% read errors. Cloudflare's report attributes the incident to an incorrectly configured credential rotation. Instead of being targeted at the production API front end to the R2 service, new credentials were instead deployed into a development environment. When the the old credentials were consequently deleted, the production gateway to R2 stopped being able to talk to its backend storage services, and so outage. On the one hand, bravo to Cloudflare for using proper kinds of layered security within its own infrastructure. That's great, and it's exactly what they should be doing. But on the other hand, boo! These kinds of errors can probably not be made impossible, but can almost certainly be made harder. And what for me should be more to the point, the environment itself, especially at some place like Cloudflare, which has such an enormous service window and envelope, should be built to notice errors like this faster and make them easier to remediate. It seems like this is the sort of thing that should have been flagged by automation within a minute or two and repaired almost as quickly. Any thoughts beyond the obvious that human error is dangerous?
Well, first of all, I do want to give Cloudflare a virtual donut for honesty, not
True.
just for their configuration. You can't fix something until you acknowledge what happened, and too often companies try to pretend that something else happened. And secondly, this reminds me of a conversation I had recently about the value of a simple checklist. There's actually a book about it called The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right by Atul Gawande. You can see the link in show notes. We have nothing to do with Atul Gawande. I just think it's interesting. Whether there's automation involved or not, maybe Cloudflare needs a check that the target is correct item in its checklist before deploying something, so it knows whether to deploy it to development or production. And sort of more broadly, I think it's incredibly important to invest the brain power into what are all the items we want to check off before we get to launch or whatever it is. And as most folks are aware, pilots use checklists to this day, despite the high degree of automation in planes, because no matter how skilled you are, there's always the possibility of missing an item on the checklist. And of course, we could have a fun conversation about how to effectively and efficiently integrate checklists with automation. But the bottom line is there should be a checklist in here somewhere.
Absolutely.
Hey everybody, let's take a quick break for a message from sponsor Palo Alto Networks. Today's businesses are adapting to a hybrid workforce with employees working at corporate branches, home offices, and on the go. Digital transformation initiatives and new AI capabilities are key to maintaining relevance in a changing global marketplace and transforming operations with enhanced automation and increased productivity. To get a handle on all this, you're invited to join Palo Alto Networks at SASE Converge, the industry's premier virtual event. Available now to stream on demand, SASE Converge brings you experts and technologists from leading organizations across the globe who reveal precisely how AI-powered SASE is transforming IT and end-user experiences while raising the bar on security. See why Palo Alto Networks was recently recognized as the 2-times leader in the 2024 Gartner Magic Quadrant for single-vendor SASE, and get insights on enabling Gen AI apps for your workforce, the latest innovations for the industry's only integrated enterprise browser, and creating a seamless IT experience. Watch on demand now at saseconverge.paloaltonetworks.com. That's saseconverge.paloaltonetworks.com. And now back to the podcast.
All right. Well, continuing on our theme on our sort of broader theme on AI and AI infrastructure that we've touched on over the past several episodes, SoftBank announced that it is buying Ampere for $6.5 billion. SoftBank announced Wednesday that it intends to buy Ampere Computing for $6.5 billion, amplifying its stake in the non-Intel face of cloud and AI computing. Ampere, for those who don't know, makes server CPUs that are based on ARM architectures, such as the ones that are widely used in cell phones. SoftBank bought ARM back in 2016. Between the tight market for NVIDIA GPUs and their escalating power demands, SoftBank seems to be betting that the world of AI is ready for the kind of power-sipping processors used in mobile devices. And I think that's actually a key point to emphasize. These energy-efficient processors become very, very interesting for cloud and AI computing. So this highlights that ongoing interest in energy-efficient AI infrastructure that we've been talking about for several episodes. John, any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's also good to note that I think we also reported a few weeks back on how Microsoft is shifting its own deployment of ARM-based processing from Ampere systems to ones that it's developed itself, which is just further underscoring how important this piece of the market is likely to become in the near term.
Okay.
So next up, we have regulation land, and the EU says Apple and Google have violated a law and demand changes in their behavior. It has imposed no fines on them yet. The EU's executive branch, the European Commission, said in separate statements released on March 18th that Apple and Google, or I should say Apple and Alphabet, have violated the EU's Digital Markets Act, a law passed in 2022 and intended to ensure fair competition in the digital economy in the EU. Alphabet was found to have used Google's dominant search engine to push people to other Google services, unfairly disadvantaging competitors. It was also found to have used unfair restrictions on its Google Play App Store to limit what app developers could offer to customers. Apple was instructed to make it easier for other connected device makers to sync their own smartwatches or headsets or whatever with iOS devices like iPads and iPhones. Although commission regulators levied no fines at this time or made any other punitive measures, they may yet do so if the companies fail to change their practices in response to these findings.
Well, and of course, I think the U.S. administration has responded with a "that's so unfair, you're such mean people, that's ridiculous" kind of response. So
If they haven't
the U.S.
yet, they will soon.
I believe they did actually, because I remember reading it like some statement effectively to that effect. But John, I listen to all of this and I go, okay, but how is this not a slap on the wrist? I mean, like, what exactly is going to happen here? Are Apple and Google going to do anything?
I suspect that they are going to respond in the courts rather than in the market. And I suspect that, and this is just me suspecting, I suspect that the EU will respond in kind and will actually take the next step and implement punitive measures of some sort in the market, including fines and possibly quite hefty fines. If I remember the law, it allowed for significant percentage of revenues as the maximum fine. I also think it is likely that the Trump administration, if it hasn't yet, will respond strongly to any hint of actual action against these companies, even though they're not big friends of the administration themselves and have a on-again, off-again relationship with regulation here. So we'll see. It's going to be a big mess, is what I think is my nutshell analysis. It's going to be a big mess, and it's going to pit two different threads of thought in the US administration against each other, and it's going to pit different parts of the EU government against different enemies. They're going to be reacting against the administration, and they're going to be reacting against the companies. So big mess, big mess.
Okay, so the too long didn't read responses. It's just going to be a big mess for everybody. All right, let's leave that big mess behind on Earth and jump into space networking, which is still a feature of this show. We have a couple of announcements here. First is record-breaking quantum key distribution in space. Chinese scientists claim to have transmitted encrypted messages almost 13,000 kilometers, 12,900 kilometers, via microsatellite. I'll talk about what that means in a second, which would be a new distance record for free space quantum key distribution. The feat, which was reported in Nature in March, involves sending an encryption key from China to South Africa to Cape Town. The satellite sent free space laser light, which was placed into quantum states from a rooftop in Beijing to a rooftop near Cape Town, South Africa. Interestingly, the satellite used was said to be 10 times lighter, 45 times cheaper, and much more energy efficient than previous satellites, And the ground station receiver has gone from, I believe, a couple thousand kilograms down to a mere 100 kilograms, which is 220 pounds. It's also worth noting this is the forefront of a trend. There are about a dozen quantum satellites that are being prepared for deployment, there we go, around the world as companies begin to invest in a global quantum key distribution network. So from my perspective, there are a couple of interesting comments here. First is that there's a whole selection of firsts. The smallest, lightest satellite, smallest, lightest ground station, longest distance for free space versus fiber optic key transmission, and portending the future availability of this kind of global quantum key distribution network. I will also add that way back in the Pleistocene era, I was doing research on encoding for free space laser transmission. I do particularly remember how difficult the coding was to avoid, to replace the bits to repair the signal if a bird flew through the signal. And I remember asking the professor, why are we doing this? Who would ever use this? Would anyone ever consider sending data via free space laser? And his response was, no, nobody's ever going to use this. So I'm always delighted to hear these kinds of feats. But John, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I'm just having fond memories of trying to persuade some friends of ours at a railroad to deploy free space lasers for some of their troublesome WAN links along deep rural
I remember
locations,
that.
right? So to my mind, there's two forks of really interesting stuff here. One is what they did with the free space lasers, because I think that's going to turn out to be useful in a lot of contexts, not just quantum satellite based key distributions. The other is that I think we're going to see satellite based quantum key distribution become a fixture in military and government top secret networking. The whole idea of having a secure, compartmentalized information facility that's mobile, but every bit as secure as one that's not. I think this is going to become a key piece of that portfolio of technologies.
I would agree, although not precisely this one for two reasons. One is A, it belongs to China.
Well, yeah.
B, but B, these are not quite as secure as they could be because simply in order to get that lightness of the microsatellite, they had to actually sacrifice a few things, which means effectively, although if you can't eavesdrop on the transmission, it is theoretically possible to hack the satellites, which is the topic of our next and final item. So there will probably be a little more engineering required before that happens. But yes, I agree with your assessment 100%, John.
And that last item is International Telecommunications Union and others warn the UN of rising satellite navigation jamming and spoofing attacks. The ITU, as well as the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization, in a joint statement to the UN member states recently expressed grave concern, quote, about the increasing number of cases of intentional interference in the radio navigation satellite service spectrum. Services using the RNSS frequencies are critical to navigation for civil aircraft, maritime vessels, humanitarian assistance vehicles, and also for time synchronization of telecommunications networks globally. The agencies further said that states must urgently enhance protections against jamming and spoofing attacks aimed at disrupting the global navigation satellite system, which operates in the RNS frequency bands. Johna, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think what I like best about this announcement is that it highlights the fact that cybersecurity is no longer about phones, laptops, and servers alone. Now that every piece of equipment has what I like to call brains, ears, and a mouth, meaning a microprocessor and bidirectional communications capabilities, any one of them can be hacked, and most of the physical pieces of physical equipment are much less well protected at this point than most of our components of the information system. So when these things are hacked, bad things happen. I mean, when you think about this, if the Coast Guard can't get to you because it actually can't navigate to you, you will die. And that's not a good thing. And hackers can do that now. And that is definitely worthy of a grave warning. So just heads up, cybersecurity has gotten a lot bigger and broader than we were thinking about when we were paying such close attention to information security.
Yeah, now I'm thinking about somebody waging a bricking attack against the navigation satellites. A lot harder to replace than that cell phone.
Exactly. Okay, well, that's it for today's episode. John, where can folks get more from you?
Oh, on LinkedIn. That's my social network of choice at the moment.
And has been for years. And in fact, I can attest to the fact that John is there and does great things. I'm Johna Johnson. You can find me at LinkedIn, and you can also find both of us at Nemerdes.com. Just go ahead and click the Contact Us button, and we'll take it away. Hope to hear from you. Thanks very much.